Hi folks, this is an online training that covers policies and incident response. So the way this will work is that you will watch this video that has this presentation in its entirety. You can refer back to it at any time, whether that's now during training or throughout the year, and then at the end we will ask you to do an online training that the instructions for which will be provided to you in an email. So let's jump right in. The first thing that we want to talk about is the policies. It's very important for RAs to know all of the policies of both living in the residence halls and UW apartments and for just general students on campus, because we do ask RAs to help enforce these policies and spread the knowledge to students so they know what's expected of them. So first I wanted to talk about where do our policies come from? So a lot of students come in, they might not know the policies. It's important to know from where do these policies come. So the first thing is safety. We have a lot of policies that are centered around keeping residents and students safe at the University of Wyoming. So that's one of the big reasons why we have a lot of our policies. Next is the Student Code of Conduct, and that is a document that outlines policies and expectations that all students at the University of Wyoming must abide by, and that is something that we'll be discussing in depth in this presentation, so more to come on that. In addition to the policies in the Student Code of Conduct, we also have what we call the community living policies, which are policies that affect only students who live in the halls and apartments in the Honors House. So only policies that relate to living on campus at UW. And then of course we ask our students to abide by all federal, state, and local laws, and so that is captured in our policies as well. And if it isn't written in our policies, if it's a law, we still expect folks to abide by that. So let's get started with the UW Student Code of Conduct. So what I'd like to do in this section is go through all of the different elements of the Student Code of Conduct, all the different policies. Some we'll spend more time on than others, but this is an important document for you as a student and of course your residents as students as well to be aware of. So like I said earlier, these are rules that apply to all UW students regardless of where the action takes place. So that could be on campus or off campus. It's administered by the Dean of Students office and it gives RLDS, that's our department, the authority to set our own additional policies, which we'll go over later in this presentation as the community living policies. So we'll go over that a little bit later. It's important to note, if you have looked at the Code of Conduct in the past, it was overhauled over the summer, so there have been a lot of changes. Not a lot has changed to the actual policies, but the way that they are worded and the way that they are laid out has changed quite a bit, and the same is true with our policies for ResLife. So I'll go through all of those things. And students and yourselves, you all can find the code at the Dean of Students website. So the Code of Conduct has its policies broken into a variety of different categories. And the first category are policies related to integrity. And so I'll go over the 5 that are under this section. The first is complicity, and that is something that if you've been in ResLife for a while, that is something that we used to call passive involvement. So basically what this is saying that if you are around someone else violating a policy, our expectation of you as a student is that you either remove yourself from that situation so you are no longer around the policy violation, or you try to stop the behavior, whether that's by telling someone to knock it off or calling a staff member at the university to end the behavior. Where we see this most often in the residence halls is around drugs and alcohol, so it is a policy violation to be around those behaviors even if you aren't the one doing the behavior. So we expect you to either report it, stop it, or remove yourself from the situation. False reporting, so that is kind of what it sounds like. If you intentionally make a report of something that happened, a policy violation or a crime, and that is not true, that is a violation. False representation is basically lying or lying by omission to the university on any documents or when talking to university officials. That would include you all as RAs, so if your residents withhold information when you're asking or don't tell the truth to you or a residence coordinator, that's a policy violation. Forgery or unauthorized use kind of is a catch-all for a lot of different things. So this could be forging documents to the university or accessing something that you're not supposed to. And that could be electronically or in person. So that could be going into a building that you're not supposed to be in, or it could be accessing a computer program or information that you don't have authorization to access. And then theft is pretty self-explanatory, taking something that doesn't belong to you, whether that belongs to the university or an individual or a group. The next category of policy in the Code of Conduct is community policies, and so a lot of different things under here. So classroom disruption is something that doesn't really affect us here in the residence halls, but know that that is prohibited. Disorderly conduct is a broad catch-all policy about kind of disturbing the peace, so acting in a way that interferes with others' ability to enjoy a space or learn or be in their community. Disruption or obstruction is basically interfering with university operations. So anything that prevents the university from operating normally is something that is not allowed. Fire safety we'll go over in much more depth when we get to the residence hall specific policies. But basically, as a student at the University of Wyoming, you can't create a fire hazard. If there's an evacuation or a fire alarm, you have to get out of the building. That's federal law. And you also can't tamper with any fire safety equipment. University policies basically says that there are policies that students must follow that might not be captured explicitly in the Code of Conduct, and so that might include our own RLDS policies. There are IT policies for acceptable use. There are policies in university regulations. So the code does its best to put all the policies that students need to know about, but this just says that there are some things that might not be in the code that students still need to follow. Property damage could include, damaging property, obviously, and also vandalism. So basically, if it belongs to the university and you are responsible for damaging it or stealing it, that is obviously not allowed. Unauthorized entry is going somewhere you're not supposed to, and that, just like in the last slide, includes electronic entry. So that could be hacking, that could be accessing something you're not allowed, things like that. And weapons, that's an important policy for RAs to know. So you can't possess, use, or store weapons, and of course explosives are included in that as well. And that includes both in your residence hall room or your apartment and your vehicle. So a lot of students think, oh, if I can't have my weapon or my firearm or my ammunition in my room, I'll just store it in my vehicle. If that vehicle is on campus, that is still a violation of that policy under federal law. And as most of you probably know, UWPD can store firearms or hunting bows. I think it's up to 3 per student, and you have 24-hour access to those items, but they are not able to store ammunition. So basically, ammunition is completely prohibited from campus, and that's important because a lot of our students will come in and maybe they like to go hunting or like to go to a shooting range on the weekend. These are important policies for them to know. And then the last policy on this slide is interfering with an active bystander. So here at the University of Wyoming, we really encourage students to become active bystanders, which means taking action in a situation where you notice a policy violation or a safety concern or an incident that just doesn't feel right. And if someone interferes with you as a bystander doing that or tries to intimidate you with the intent of getting you to stop helping others, that is a policy violation. The next category of policy is what they call social justice policies, and so this includes harassment, threats, bullying. You'll learn a lot more about specific sexual harassment or sexual misconduct policies in other trainings, but know that obviously at the University of Wyoming we prohibit harassment, threatening others, and bullying. We also prohibit discrimination, and so there's a list here on this slide about the different identities or statuses that UW protects from discrimination. So if folks are being discriminated on the basis of any of these factors, then that is a policy violation. And you'll learn in other trainings throughout RA training about, if you learn about this, who do you report that to? Another policy violation would be interfering with the conduct process. The conduct process is what the university uses to investigate and resolve instances where a student is suspected to have violated a policy. And so interfering with the conduct process could involve lying to a hearing officer by misrepresenting information, omitting important information. False reporting would also fall under this, or harassing or intimidating or otherwise retaliating against anyone involved in the process. So that would be, if my roommate goes in and tells the RC in a conduct meeting that I was drinking, and I was hoping that information wouldn't get out, and then I find out that he did that and go back and give him a hard time, that would be interfering with the conduct process. Or just not following instructions of a hearing officer. We see that a lot with failure to show up for your meeting, failure to complete your sanctions, things like that. And then retaliation, I explained a little bit, that is taking action against someone who either reports something or trying to prevent someone from participating in an investigation. So anything that you do to prevent that or make it give someone a hard time for participating in the process or letting the university know that something happened, that's what retaliation is, and it is not allowed. The next category of policies in the Student Code of Conduct are respect policies. So the first broad category here is sexual misconduct, and I'm not going to go over all of the specific sub-bullet points here because you do have a specific online training through the university about sexual misconduct, so you'll learn a lot more about that in that training. But also, in addition to sexual misconduct, is our hazing policy. And so if you learn of any students who might have been affected by hazing, whether they are trying to join an RSO or perhaps a Greek organization or really any group at the University of Wyoming, and that behavior you think might be hazing, make sure that you report that, because that would be a violation of the Student Code of Conduct. And then, of course, physical violence is prohibited on the University of Wyoming campus. And so that includes all types of violence, including fighting, assaulting, battering, especially using a weapon that's very serious, keeping or transporting someone against their will, so preventing someone from leaving or kidnapping them in your vehicle, or even threatening bodily harm. That all falls under physical violence. In the Code of Conduct, we do have at the University of Wyoming an explicit definition of what sexual consent is, and this is something that's important for you as RAs to know, and especially your students to know, because when we get into cases of sexual misconduct, this definition of consent becomes very important about determining, was the activity that happened, was there consent present for that? So I'm going to read this to you because I do think that it's so important. So here at the University of Wyoming, we define that consent is a freely and affirmatively communicated willingness to participate in a particular sexual activity or behavior, and that is expressed by either words or clear, unambiguous actions. So we don't at the University of Wyoming need verbal consent necessarily, although that is very helpful in determining consent. But if we don't use our words, there needs to be clear, unambiguous actions that said to the person initiating the sexual activity that the other person consented to that happening. It says that initiators of sexual activity are the ones responsible for obtaining consent. And then it's very important for folks to realize that silence or being passive does not imply consent. So if you don't say anything, if you didn't say no or didn't resist in any way, that doesn't necessarily mean that you consented to that activity happening. And then, of course, the use of intimidation, coercion, threats, or force of violence negates any consent. So if you are threatening someone, and even if they verbally say yes, that negates the consent, so no consent is present, and that would be sexual misconduct. And then also, consent is not present if obtained from an individual who is incapable of giving consent due to lack of consciousness, age, mental disability, or incapacitation due to use of drugs or alcohol. So with age, that means if you're under the legal age of consent in the state of Wyoming. That doesn't apply to our students very often, but might to guests or minors in any way. Obviously, someone who is asleep or unconscious can't provide consent. And then folks who are intoxicated or under the influence of other substances also cannot legally provide consent. So that definition is very important for students to know, and is something that we hope to communicate to them through Cowboy Connect and orientation, but it's important for you as RAs to know as well. All right, and then the next subcategory of policies within the Code of Conduct are responsibility policies. And so here's where we get all of the different nuances under alcohol. So here are the alcohol policies under the code, and then we'll go over some additional ones that are part of our RLDS policies in just a few minutes. So obviously students who are under the legal drinking age, which is 21 years old, cannot possess or consume alcohol or have any alcohol containers anywhere on campus, including their rooms, their vehicles, anywhere. That is against the law. And then anyone, regardless of how old you are, cannot be publicly under the influence of alcohol. So that's our public intoxication policy. Obviously, we can't drive under the influence of alcohol, so no DUI. And in the state of Wyoming, for folks who are under 21, it is a DUI or driving under the influence with any type of alcohol in your system. So if you're of age, it's 0.08, and if you're not of age, it's anything above 0.00. Folks who are over 21 cannot provide alcohol to those under 21. Similarly, if you're underage and you have alcohol, you can't share that with others who are also underage. You cannot provide a location for under 21 individuals to possess or consume alcohol. So even if you didn't provide the alcohol and you didn't consume it underage, if you provided your room or your apartment or a vehicle or some type of location for that activity to occur, that's a policy violation. You can't possess or transport an open container of alcohol, so any alcohol that is legally consumed has to be done in private, not in public. And you can't be incapacitated due to alcohol use, even if you're not in public. So if you're really drunk, if you're passing out, if you're vomiting, things like that, that is not allowed on campus, even if you're in the privacy of your own room or apartment. And then, just like federal and state law, you can't possess or use a fake identification. Drugs basically says that any illegal drugs is not allowed at the University of Wyoming, and that also includes providing a location for others to possess or consume drugs, or knowingly being in the presence of drugs. So that would speak to the complicity policy that we talked about before. Just a note about marijuana. Marijuana use is not legal marijuana use is not recognized for recreational or medicinal purposes in the state of Wyoming, so it's prohibited in all forms and in all circumstances, and the state of Wyoming does not recognize medical marijuana cards. So basically you cannot have marijuana under any circumstance anywhere within the state of Wyoming. Also within responsibility is failure to comply. Basically this says that folks need to abide by any instructions given to them by the university, whether it's officials or via email, and that includes you all as RAs. So if you all, within the scope of your duties, ask a resident to do something, they need to listen to you. And if they don't, that's failure to comply, and that's a policy violation. And then lastly, gambling is prohibited on campus. So any type of gambling activity where you're exchanging money or gambling for items of any value, that is not allowed on campus. Okay, so that's the Student Code of Conduct. Now we're going to talk about the RLDS community living policies. So for those of you who have been with us for a little while, whether as an RA or a resident, this is the document that was formerly called the P&P, the Policies and Procedures. We have renamed it to the Community Living Policies. And new this year, instead of having all of the policies, anything you could think of that pertains to students living on campus, we reduced that document to include only the policies that are in addition to the Student Code of Conduct. So we really want students to understand that the Student Code of Conduct is something that they need to be aware of, and those policies apply to them regardless of where they are in their experience at the university. And then these community living policies are only for folks who live on campus. So it's in addition to the code. Students are going to be provided with a hard copy of these policies when they move in, and they can also find it on the RLDS website, and so can you. So it's up there for you to view. So in the next couple of slides, we'll go over those specific community living policies, the ones that will really affect you all and are important for you to know as RAs. So the first is alcohol policies. So these are in addition to the alcohol policies that are in the Student Code of Conduct that we already went over. The first is where you can have alcohol if you're 21. Obviously, if you're not 21, you cannot have alcohol anywhere because it's against the law, but this is where you can have alcohol if you are of age. Now, as a note, before I go into these policies, this policy has changed from previous years. In the past, our policies have been a little different, with Hill Hall being an upper class hall, but now with that being offline, we changed things up just a little bit. So now, if you are of age and you live in the residence halls, the honors house, or the apartments, you can have alcohol if you're of age in your private room, but you must have the door shut, or anywhere within your apartment. So you must be in your room or your apartment unless you are visiting someone who is over the age of 21. So what that means is, if I'm of age and my buddy down the hall in my residence hall, or maybe in the apartment next to me, if they're not of age, I cannot go to their room or their apartment and consume alcohol. So basically, we allow alcohol in a unit or a room as long as the leaseholder or the person who owns that room is also of age. So that's important. So that's the big departure from the Washakie halls. They're no longer completely dry. You can have alcohol if you are 21. Places you cannot have alcohol if you're over 21. No one can have alcohol in any common area, which would be your fish bowls, in the community center, in the honors house kitchen, lobbies, stairwells, hallways. And then also a bit new this year for Bison Run in particular, we're defining now that all areas within your apartment are considered private, so you can have alcohol there if you're over 21. So in the past with Bison Run apartments, if you were not 21, or if you were over 21 but you had other roommates who were not, you could only have alcohol in your private room. We've changed that now that you can have that in the kitchen area or the living room. That is totally fine as long as no one who is not of age is consuming. Here within the residence halls and apartments, we prohibit drinking games or any types of games that are modeled after drinking games. So beer pong obviously would not be acceptable, but also games like water pong that kind of mimic drinking games are not allowed, or any containers that encourage overconsumption. So kegs are not allowed, beer bongs, anything like that. And then alcohol containers, whether they are empty, full, whatever, cannot be used as decorations if you're under 21. So for folks in the halls, or apartments for folks who are under 21, if you are addressing a situation and a student tries to tell you, oh, well, this is just a Jack Daniel's bottle that I used to put flowers in, I never drank it, it was my parents or whatever, that empty container is not allowed unless they're of age. Next would be pets. So within all of our residence halls and all of our apartments, with the exception of Landmark, which I'll get to in just a moment, you cannot have pets with the exception of fish, unless it is an approved service animal or an emotional support animal, and that needs to be approved by the University Disability Support Services office before the animal arrives on campus. So students will go to UDSS, get that animal approved. UDSS will contact Residence Life and Dining, and then the RC will sit down with them to go over animal expectations, and all of that needs to happen before the animal arrives on campus. And so if you see an animal that is not an approved assistance animal, that's likely a violation of that policy. And the exception to all of this is that new this year, we are allowing students in Landmark Square to have pets as long as they go through the approval process. There's some paperwork that they need to fill out. They have to pay a pet deposit. So we're trying out being pet friendly in our Landmark apartments, and folks who are on the apartment staff, you will be trained specifically on what that looks like, but just know that that is an exception within our facilities. Another policy we want to draw your attention to is cleanliness. So basically that means that you need to keep your space clean. But more specifically, folks need to take out their trash, keep their space to a healthy level of clean. If they have anything that's broken or any maintenance concerns, they need to report that so we can fix it. And basically, they need to comply with any directions of RLDS staff if asked to address a concern. So, if maintenance says you can't use your hot water for a few hours, and then they go ahead and try to use that, they need to abide by our policies. things like that. Or if we say that your room is not up to safety, health and safety standards with cleanliness, and we say you need to take out your trash or clean up a little bit, folks need to comply with those requests and do that. And then something that I think is funny that we really need at the University of Wyoming, but perhaps not at other schools, is that our students cannot clean or dress animal carcasses in any of our RLDS buildings, and folks are welcome to store meat in any community freezer. But if it's game meat, it needs to be properly dressed off-site, obviously. So they can't just, throw a big frozen chunk of a deer in one of our freezers. That's not appropriate. And then lastly, with cleanliness, they need to report any pest management issues that they're having to our staff, and then follow the instructions provided by facilities. So this really applies a lot to bed bugs. So if our staff says that you need to bag your items, or if you need to do this or that, it's really important that folks respect that and follow those processes so we can take care of the issue. With cooking, we need all of our appliances to be under 800 watts except for laptops and computers, and that's 800 watts per appliance. And then for microfridges, they also need to be under 800 watts, but also under 4.5 cubic feet. And then with cooking, you can't leave your cooking unattended. This is mostly for the apartments, so if you have something on the stove or in the oven, you need to be in your apartment. You cannot leave it. That's a big fire hazard. And then apartment residents cannot have grills, whether that's inside or outside. So apartment RAs, that's something that we see a lot, so take note of that. And then no appliances with open heating elements are allowed, so toasters, hot plates, etc. And the exception is for our folks living in the apartments or folks in the honors house. You can have those items only in the kitchen area, so not in your private bedrooms. Then we have some Washakie policies. So most of these are no-brainers in Washakie. You need to wear your shirt and shoes. That is part of the health code food safety policies. You can't throw food. You can't steal items from Washakie. You can't remove food or drinks from Washakie unless it's in the swipe, fill, and go to-go box or your Washakie mug. And you can't ride your skateboard, rollerblade, scooter in Washakie. And you also have to return your tray and your food once you're done. So those are the Washakie policies. Moving on with community living policies, with decorations, we can't cover any exit signs, alarms, detectors, extinguishers, basically anything that is designed for safety. You can't cover that with any of your decorations. We prohibit folks from doing any wall damage, so no duct tape is allowed in any of our buildings. You can't use wall nails or screws, and residents need to know that if they do use those items, that they'll be charged for any damage once they move out. And then an important policy that a lot of students might not know coming in is that you can't display anything in your window or hanging outside your window. So that would be flags, signs, advertisements, tapestries, anything like that. So when we look up at your window, all we should see is your window and your blinds. That's it. For fire safety, basically nothing flammable. So no flammable liquids. We can't have candles in any of our facilities. Wax warmers, including Scentsy products or similar items. No incense, no dried plants. This becomes an issue really around the holidays when folks try to have dried Christmas trees. That's not allowed. Big fire hazard there. And then also no tampering with fire safety equipment. And this includes putting a plastic bag over your smoke detector, which usually indicates that someone is smoking something with inside their room or using incense or something. So that is definitely a major policy violation. We need all of our safety equipment to be functional at all times to keep residents safe. With furniture, folks can't move their fishbowl furniture to their room or to other floors, and they could be billed for that at checkout. And we do have a community billing policy where if any common furniture goes missing or if there's any damage to common areas, we do split those costs up for all residents on that floor or within that hall if it exceeds $5 per resident. And we're not able to find out who might be responsible for that damage or what might be missing. And then also anything that folks leave behind after they leave, whether that's for checkout or whether they just decide to peace out from the halls or apartments, is considered abandoned property, and we will dispose of that, and residents might be charged for the time that it takes custodial to remove those items. And so basically, folks just need to remove all their items when they leave. Weapons was talked about a little bit in the Student Code of Conduct. Plus, you cannot have weapons as decorations. And with pocket knives, those need to be under 3 inches. So if you have a knife that's over 3 inches, it better be for cooking purposes. So that's the only time that we'll allow a knife in excess of 3 inches. Windows, balconies, and rooftops basically means that you can't hang out of your window, throw or drop items out of your window, you can't remove your window screen, and you can't go on any balcony or rooftop. And then especially important in the UW apartments is that we do not allow window-mounted air conditioners. In the halls, that's a little less important because our windows are not big enough to fit those, but we do see that quite a bit in the apartments. And then with smoking, you can't smoke anything inside. That is a big fire safety and building just facility issue. So the university policy is that you need to be 20 feet away from an entryway. You need to clean up your cigarette butts. You can't just leave those kind of wherever. And the smoking policy includes obviously cigarettes, e-cigarettes, vape pens, hookahs, etc. So basically, even if someone says, hey, it's not actual smoking, it's just vaping or whatever, that is included under our smoking policy. And just for folks in the halls, vaping does set off our fire alarms, and so a lot of residents think that that is not the case, but they are incorrect. So they need to not do that inside. Also with community living policies, we have our guest policy. So in general, guests must sign into the residence hall and be accompanied by their host at all times. So guests cannot be left alone for any reason. And the resident who is hosting that guest is responsible for that guest behavior at all times. So even if the guest is the one who broke a policy, it's the resident who's responsible for that guest who's going to get in trouble if that happens. And then in terms of how many guests you're allowed to have overnight, it differs a little bit from the halls to the apartments. So in the halls, you must have your roommate's approval, and they can only stay 3 nights within a 14-day period. And because our rooms are pretty small, you can't have more than 2 overnight guests per room at any given time. And then in the apartments, still you must have roommate approval. That's particularly important in Bison Run. And then if a guest is here for more than 14 nights in a semester, they need to be listed as a roommate on the lease. So that's the nuance for the apartments. Hall sports basically means that any type of sporting activity, throwing items, roughhousing, water fighting, roping, those things cannot happen inside or around our buildings. You can't ride your bicycle, skateboard, rollerblade, scooter, anything with wheels inside a building, including Washakie, halls, apartments. And then also we have a no hoverboard or self-balancing scooter policy, as well as a no drone policy that would fall under hall sports. So that's important for folks to know. Lockouts and keys basically says that if you lock yourself out or lose a key, we'll charge you. For lockouts, residents will get 2 free lockouts per semester, and then after that it's a $5 fee every time you get locked out. Child supervision is something that's only really relevant to the apartments. We have a lot of apartment residents who have children and they need to supervise them appropriately, and if they're not supervising or if we think that there might be child neglect, we'll call UWPD for them to address that. Solicitation basically means that no one, whether they're a resident or a visitor, can go around knocking door to door in the apartments or the halls trying to sell something or promote anything at all. Door-to-door soliciting of any kind is prohibited. And then also because the university residence halls and apartments are owned by the state, it is against state law for you to operate a business from your residential unit. Quiet hours are something you probably heard about, but it's an important thing for you to know that they have changed slightly this year. So our weekend quiet hours are the same. So those begin at midnight and go until 8 a.m. But on the weekend, on the weeknights, so Sunday through Thursday night, we did bump those up to 10 p.m. So starting at 10 p.m. and then still ending at 8 a.m. Quiet hours means that we shouldn't be able to hear you really at all, and any noise that goes out beyond the boundaries of your room or your apartment is a violation. And then courtesy hours basically means that even when it's not quiet hours, we need you to be respectful of those around you and not have excess noise. Specifically within the community living policies, it says that we shouldn't be able to hear you 2 doors down, but from your perspective as RAs, we'll train you to use your discretion about what might be excessive noise outside of quiet hours. Okay, so those are the policies. I know that that's a lot. Both of those documents, both the Code of Conduct and the Community Living Policies, can be found online. It's very important, as I mentioned, for RAs to know what those policies are because you're relaying that information to your residents, and we're asking you to respond to policy violations. So this next half of this presentation is going to talk about incident response, or what to do when stuff happens. So first let's talk about what type of stuff might happen in the halls or apartments that you as an RA might need to take action regarding. So really, I think we can divide that into 4 different categories of incidents. So a policy violation might occur and we take action based on that. We might encounter a facilities issue, something broken or something that needs to be addressed for safety of or integrity of the facility. A student might have a concern or an issue, or there might just be in general safety issues that we need to address. And before I go on to what to do in these different situations, I want to talk about, so why do you all as RAs, why should you care about these things that might happen? So for each of these different elements or types of incidents, for policy violations, we care about that because it's the RA's role to help ensure that students have a safe, respectful, and healthy community, and our policies are really there to make sure that that happens. So when we address a policy violation, it's because we want students to understand what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, to be held accountable for that behavior, and to understand that their actions have consequences and impacts oftentimes on others around them, that we're all part of a community and there are expectations that go along with living in that community. Facilities issues, hopefully I don't need to convince you that those are important. You know, the halls and apartments are where a student lives. It's their home. And we want everything to be in good working order. We want it to be a comfortable place to live. We want things to be clean and well functioning. And we want our facilities to last for this year's residents and residents in years to come. And so addressing those and making sure we get the proper people here to fix things is really important. And then for student and safety issues, we want folks to be safe and secure. That's a priority that we have on the University of Wyoming campus. And so often you all as RAs will notice issues before full-time staff members do because you're the ones who are on the floors. You're the ones who residents will come to report things that happened. And so RAs can make a really big difference by reporting these things when they learn of them, so we can get people the help that they might need, connect them to a resource, or whatever that response might look like. So in general, before I go over some specific incident response protocol, here are some questions to just keep in mind when you're addressing a situation. So let's say you encounter something when you're on call, or a resident comes up to you and says, "Hey, this happened." It's first important to assess, are residents safe? Is there a potential that the situation could become unsafe? And we'll talk about what to do if something is that level of serious with regards to safety. Ask yourself, is the building safe and secure? Can someone get in the building who's not supposed to get in the building? If something's broken, do we need to fix that immediately? If we don't fix it, will it do more damage? Or is it something that the residents can live without until tomorrow, or if it's on the weekends, until Monday? Think about, are there other resources on campus that could help this student? So that might be the counseling center, or some type of academic support service, or maybe a doctor. And does the student need these resources right now, or can it wait? And we'll talk about kind of how to decide that in future slides. And then also, is the university policy being violated? And if so, we need to take some action, and we'll talk about that. So in the next couple of slides, what I'm going to do is go over those different types of incidents and what the different response might be. Now, what I want to mention is that in your RA manual, you have a very long section that talks about just about everything that could happen within the residence halls and apartments, and step by step what you're supposed to do in all of those situations. But instead of boring you by going through all of those, you can read that for yourself in the RA manual. I want to go by category of incident and help you understand what is a minor issue and what is a more serious issue, and when do we need to get a supervisor like your RC or LOC involved, and when do we need to get UWPD involved, and also when do we need to write an incident report. So that's what these next slides are intended to go over. So first, let's start with talking about facilities issues. So first, starting with minor issues. So what do I mean by minor issue? That means an issue that can wait till the next day or maybe even a couple of days to fix. It's not a safety issue, and residents can live without that repair for a couple of days. It might be inconvenient, it might not be ideal, but they can live without it for a couple of days without having it be too much of a burden. So examples for this would be a light bulb might be out. Now, if all the lights in a room are out, that might be a different story, but maybe like one of the lights in the fishbowl, or a light in an elevator, or a light down a hallway, or a resident's vanity light, but the other room light is okay. That's a minor issue. A lock being dead. You'll learn in desk training that we can issue a hard key temporarily while the lock gets fixed. If there's a minor mess that's in a fishbowl or maybe an elevator, if a door is sticking but it still functions properly, if there's something minor broken, like maybe a handle on a drawer or a drippy faucet, but it's not a huge leak. If an elevator goes down, no one's stuck inside of it, and there are other elevators that are working just fine. Any minor vandalism, those are things that we don't need to call after hours maintenance or custodial to repair immediately. Those are things that generally can wait. So for minor facilities issues, what you all do as RAs is submit a work order, unless it's, let's say, a minor mess. If it's something really minor, like maybe a piece of fruit or something that from late night that you notice in a tunnel, if you have the ability to clean that up with some supplies that are behind the desk, go ahead and do that. Or if the resident responsible is involved, definitely make them do that. But we want to make sure that we can take care of messes that are minor, that don't present a safety hazard. And then for things that are broken, that are minor, we just submit a work order. And for these issues, in general, no incident report is needed, because the work order is the documentation that facilities will need, and they will get to it as they have time to do so. So more serious facilities issues, the criteria for making it more serious would be we need to address this issue now. So that might mean it poses a safety issue, or it might be unreasonable to ask residents to wait to the next day for a repair, or not addressing it now might cause further damage to the facility. So an example might be a water leak. So let's say a ceiling is dripping. That might be something that can wait, but it's probably something that we want a facilities professional to look at to make sure that there's not more damage that's going to happen if we let that continue to drip overnight. So that's something that we would want to address more seriously. Another example might be if an exterior door is broken. That presents a safety issue. We need to make sure that only people who have specific Y01 card access are the folks who can get inside of a building. So that would be a more serious issue. If an elevator is stuck and people are stuck inside it, obviously we need to get those people out of the elevator. That's a serious issue. With custodial issues, if there's any bodily fluid, blood, vomit, urine that's found in a common area, that's something that we want a custodial professional to clean up. If those items are within someone's private room, then it's on them that they need to clean that up themselves. But if it's in a common area, we'll have custodial do that for us. Broken glass, significant amounts especially, we want custodial to clean that up just for safety issues, or a major spill or a mess. So that might be something that exceeds a resident's or you as an RA's ability to clean it up yourself. If hot water or heat is out of a room, or a power outage, those are things that we would not expect residents to live without. So if it's really cold and someone's heat is not working or their hot water is out, that is something that we want to make sure that we get facilities in right away to see what they can do. You will learn a little bit more in desk training, but our fire panels sometimes will have trouble alarms. So that is an alarm that isn't necessarily meaning that a fire event is happening, but something is wrong with the panel, and so we'll want to make sure that folks come take a look at that. Or pests, particularly bed bugs. If those are found, that is a more serious thing that we want to address in the moment. And so for these more serious issues, what you're going to do as an RA is call LOC. LOC stands for Live In On Call, and that is the RC or GRC who responds to these incidents. So you'll call LOC and they will tell you what to do next. So they may give you permission to call our after hours custodian on call or our maintenance on call or UW operations, but you are never in any circumstance calling those resources directly without first calling LOC. They will give you permission, they'll tell you what to do, and usually once you're done you'll write an IR so we know what happened and what action was taken. And then, kind of along the same veins of serious issues, some specific facilities issues that, in addition to calling LOC, you would also want to call UWPD for, would be vandalism that has a bias motivation. And what I mean by that is, if you think back to the Code of Conduct discrimination slide, if there's any vandalism that relates to any of those identities, so let's say a swastika is drawn or someone writes on a student's door, something that is degrading to one of their identities, that is something we want UWPD to get involved with. They will see if the student wants to file a report, they'll take pictures, things like that. So call LOC first and they'll let them know that you're calling UWPD, and they will want to respond as well. Obviously, with a fire, you want to call UWPD, and they'll make sure that the fire department arrives on campus. If there are solicitors or any suspicious individuals in the building, you'll want to call. And then, just like the previous section, you'll want to write an IR after these incidents are finished. So those are facilities incidents. So hopefully, it makes sense what is minor and what is not minor. So let an RC know if you have any questions about that. Okay, the next category of incidents that might happen are policy violations. So similar to the last slide, we want to talk about what is minor and what is more serious. So let's start with minor violations. So minor violations are things that, yes, they're policy violations, but you can address that on your own without calling LOC and without calling UWPD. So what do we mean by minor? This means that there's no safety concern, no substances are involved, it's really low level, and we expect that you can probably address that policy violation just by having a conversation with the resident. So some examples of this might be a noise complaint, so a quiet hours violation. Hall sports, someone like riding their skateboard throughout the hallway or throwing a ball around. Or maybe someone who has a prohibited appliance, something over 800 watts or something that's not fire safe. A cleanliness issue, so you see that someone's room is just a disaster and it's really not up to health and safety standards. Or if you are talking with a resident and you notice that they remove furniture from the fishbowl, if they're smoking in an improper location, if they have a guest who might be staying too long, all those things are pretty low level, and we hope that your RA response would be explain the policy to the resident, ask them to what we call bring their behavior into compliance, which means, if they took something from the fishbowl, you ask, hey, do you mind returning that? Or if they're smoking in an improper location, say, hey, do you mind going 20 feet from the building? Or do you mind keeping your voices down if it's during quiet hours? So ask them to stop whatever policy violation is occurring. And hopefully, in most cases, they will listen to you and they will stop that behavior. If they're not and they're uncooperative, then you would call LOC or UWPD to help you out with that. But in most cases, these are low-level things. Folks will say, okay, sure, I'll do that. And then you're still writing an incident report, and you write an incident report. You write an incident report to document any policy violation. So even if it's a small, low-level policy violation, we still want to know about that so we can follow up with the resident if we need to. More serious policy violations are violations where we would call up to LOC and get UWPD involved. So with policy violations, we at the University of Wyoming get UWPD involved quite a bit for policies that are not really minor, discussed in the last section. So for that, more serious would mean this situation would benefit from having a UWPD officer kind of handling that confrontation as opposed to you by yourself as an RA. So examples for this would be weapons, violence or fights, alcohol, drugs, any type of substance use, if a resident is being uncooperative, anything that might be bias motivated. So we mentioned in the last slide vandalism, or if there are any threats, intimidation, harassment, things like that. In the apartments, child supervision, solicitation we mentioned in the last slide, theft, hazing. If there's a riot or protest happening on campus, we want UWPD to know about that. Or if there's a suspicious person in the hall and we don't know if they're a resident, things like that. So what you do with those more serious violations is you're going to want to call UWPD dispatch. That number is saved within all of the on-call phones, and if you should also save it within your personal phone, and you can ask your supervisor what that number is. So you call UWPD dispatch, you explain what's going on, and then they will send an officer over. Then after you hang up with UWPD, you're going to want to call LOC, let them know what's happening, let them know you called UWPD and they're on their way. And then sometimes LOC will come and join you if it's really serious. Other times they'll say, okay, just give me a call when the incident is complete. But what you'll want to do is meet UWPD, meet the officers when they arrive, and follow their directions. So sometimes they'll allow you to be present and you'll just take notes. Sometimes they'll ask you to kind of stay in the lobby as they go and address the student by themselves. But make sure you're following whatever UWPD tells you to do. And then once the incident is over, you're going to want to get all the student names from the PD officer, get the case number from the police officer, and then from that information you're going to write an incident report. So it's important to know who is involved, what those students' names, W's numbers are, what the case number was, so we can follow up with the officer if we need more information later. So those are more serious policy violations. And then before we move on, there are some serious violations where we don't automatically go to UWPD, and that is particularly sexual misconduct issues. So sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, things like that. And the reason that we just call LOC and don't call the police with those situations is that it's really important when we're encountering a victim of sexual misconduct that we let them make the choice for themselves about whether they want to get PD involved, report to law enforcement. That's something that's really important for the victim to have that autonomy to make that choice themselves. So we will still write an IR, you'll still call LOC. LOC will respond on site and go from there, but that is the one exception to a serious violation that we do not jump automatically to UWPD. Okay, so next we want to talk about student and safety issues. So in the vein of the last two slides, we'll talk about minor and more serious violations. So minor issues would be there's a student issue that's happening and you can address that by yourself as an RA, and you probably want to tell your supervisor later in your next one-on-one that, hey, this happened, just so they're aware. RCs like to get to know what's going on in student lives just like you all do, but these are things that you don't need to call up to LOC or tell your supervisor about immediately. So the criteria for that would be there's no imminent safety concern. A resident might benefit from talking to a resource, but they don't need that resource right now. They don't need to talk to a professional staff member immediately. So examples for that might be a minor roommate conflict. Roommates are mad at each other, but there's no safety concern, no one feels threatened, there's not harassment happening, the student isn't demanding to be moved immediately, so it's minor. It might not feel minor to the resident, but it's something that can wait until the next day for the RC to help you address. A student telling you that they're struggling academically, so in general, they tell you that they failed a test or are just having a hard time with calculus. That's not something you necessarily need to call up to LOC for immediately unless there are other concerns that are attached to that. If a resident tells you they had a bad day, they're kind of feeling down, unless it escalates to depression or they're, really despondent or inconsolable, if it's just a bad day, that's something that you can help them through, but you don't necessarily need to call LOC for. And then with residents tell you that they had a breakup or maybe a death of a distant relative, and they seem to be okay, like they're sad, they just had a breakup, it's expected that they're a little bummed out, but they're doing okay considering, that's something that you don't necessarily need to call up to LOC. We'll talk in the next section about when that would become a more serious issue. And then minor illness. So if someone says, hey, I have a cold, or I have the flu, or I broke my arm, but I went to the doctor and I have a cast, things that are taken care of, we don't need to get them medical attention in the moment. We don't need to let LOC know immediately. So for these minor issues, what you're going to do is offer support to your resident in that moment, and then you can let your supervisor know the next time you see them or the next time in your one-on-one what happened. Usually in these cases, no incident report is required because it's pretty low level. And usually in these situations, there's not really going to be a ton of ongoing follow-up. A resident said, hey, this happened to me, you're going to be there for them in that moment, and then hopefully the issue resolves itself. For more serious, it says violations, but it really should say issues. You're going to want to call LOC. So what this means by more serious is that there might be a safety concern for a resident. We're really, really worried about them and them keeping themselves safe. Maybe a resident needs a campus resource and they would really benefit from talking to somebody right now. Usually that's a mental health concern or maybe a medical issue. Or maybe we're unsure. We're like, this might be nothing, but it could be something really serious, and we need some more evaluation needed to determine if a resident is doing okay. We definitely want to get LOC involved in that case so they can be on site and determine kind of what's going on. So some examples of this would be a more major roommate conflict. That's usually when one of the residents tells you, hey, I'm having a conflict and I feel unsafe or really uncomfortable living with this person. So we'll want to call LOC so we can see if we need to do anything, move that person temporarily, things like that. So call that up to LOC. If someone discloses that they're suffering from depression, or maybe they're having thoughts of wanting to harm themselves or take their own life, or if they're really, really sad or inconsolable, they can't stop crying, they're just extremely despondent or hysterical, those types of mental health issues are definitely things that we want to get addressed at the LOC level, and likely the LOC is going to meet with them and connect them to a counselor just to make sure that they're doing okay in that moment. If we encounter a major illness or injury, especially something that might require some follow-up by a medical professional, we're going to want to call LOC for that. If you learn of a student death, of course, you're going to want to call of LOC for that. And that, of course, would be the case if you know that a student has unfortunately passed away on campus, but also if you hear that a student who might not even live in the residence halls or apartments has passed away off campus, we want to report that up because the university will want to take some pretty swift action regarding that situation. In the previous section, it talked about a death of a family member potentially being minor. If it's a significant family member, or if the student is really not doing well with that incident that happened in their family, that's something that we want to get LOC involved with. If someone discloses that they are experiencing an eating disorder, that's something we want to call up for. Or if a resident tells us that they have been affected by or experienced a sexual assault or other sexual misconduct. That goes to your duty to report training. You are legally required to report that to a supervisor, and so that would be LOC in that case. So for these more serious incidents that might happen, your response is to call LOC, and in most of, if not all of these situations, they are going to respond on site and take over from there. And then once the incident is done, you will write an IR, because oftentimes you will know a little bit more about the background of the situation than the RC or GRC will, and so we'll have you write an IR. And then the last section that we want to talk about are serious violations where you're not only calling up to LOC, but also UWPD immediately. And so that would be an imminent safety risk. So this situation is imminently unsafe, so maybe a resident with a mental health concern, not only are they saying that they're having feelings of self-harm or suicide, but they are actively attempting to take their own lives, they are actively harming themselves, or they say that they're going to do it right now. We want to call UWPD so we can have an officer there to help address that situation. So call UWPD first and then LOC for those situations. Also, we would do that process for any illness or injury requiring medical attention. So, let's say you're addressing an alcohol situation and someone needs to be evaluated because they've had too much to drink and they're vomiting, or they might not be conscious, or someone is bleeding. If they need to go to the hospital or they need to be looked at by a paramedic or EMS, then we want to call UWPD and they will get the right resources involved. And then also, lastly, erratic student behavior. So if someone is behaving very strangely, that's probably unsafe for you to approach that student, and we want UWPD to do that instead. And so for these situations, call UWPD, then call LOC, and then you're still writing an IR afterward. Okay, we're nearing the end of this presentation, so just some other bits and pieces with incident response that we want you to be aware of. So UWPD and EMS stands for Emergency Medical Services, so that's paramedics, ambulances, fire trucks, things like that. If you see UWPD or EMS in a building, what we want you to do as RAs is approach them, identify yourself as an RA, and ask them what's going on. We talked a lot about when you notice a situation and you're calling UWPD, and then of course they're responding because you called them. Sometimes you'll notice that officers or paramedics are going to be in the building and you didn't call them. Maybe a resident called them, maybe a parent called them, and they just didn't let us know. We still want to find out what's going on so we can have a record of that, so we can follow up with a student if we need to. So approach them, ask what's going on, and please do this even if it's not your assigned hall. So where this happens a lot is we see maybe an ambulance in front of the Washakie Center and we don't know what's going on. So if you see a uniformed professional, approach them, say that you're a staff member, and ask what's going on. Sometimes they might tell you, sometimes they might not, and we'll respect that, but you always want to call LOC and let them know, hey, just an FYI, there's PD in the building. Either they told us what's going on, here's what's going on, or they said that they weren't able to tell, they went up to the 8th floor, or whatever that might be. So LOC needs to know about that. And then do know, particularly with UWPD, sometimes they will be in our buildings just to kind of hang out or say hi, especially if you're at the desk, they'll be there to just chit chat. You do not need to call LOC for that. Sometimes it might be a slow night. UWPD officers are very friendly. They want to talk to you. They want to get to know you. If they're not there responding to something, you do not need to report that to LOC. Next, I want to talk a little bit about parental contact. So when a parent calls either the duty phone or stops by or calls the desk, these are the policies that you need to keep in mind with what you're allowed to share and when you need to call an RC or LOC. So if a parent calls and they are just asking basic questions like what is the address of Whitehall, or when should my student sign up for a time to check out at the end of the year, basic things, go ahead and answer those questions about living in the halls or policies to the extent that you know that. But know that there's a federal law called FERPA that is a privacy law that basically says that we are not, as the University of Wyoming, allowed to release any student information to anyone other than the student unless they work for the university. And that includes parents. Because they are over the age of 18, that information is confidential. So if a parent calls and they say, hey, I want to know what room my student lives in or what their mailbox number is because I want to send them a birthday card or give them flowers, whatever. We are not allowed to release that information at all. And that sometimes can catch parents off guard, but we are not allowed to disclose that under federal guidelines. So make sure that you don't provide that information to folks. And then ultimately, once parents call and it's not just a basic issue, if they have a concern or maybe they're upset, we need to get them in touch with an RC or LOC. And so make sure that you're doing that. But, and this is also in the next section, please do not give the LOC number to anybody, especially to parents. You can take down parent contact information, you can set folks up with, on your RC's calendar, but in no circumstances do we want the LOC number to be shared to anyone outside of just RAs. So that is very, very important. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about student welfare checks. So what we mean by a welfare check is usually this comes from a parent. Sometimes it'll come from a faculty member or another student, but usually it's a parent, and they'll call someone at the university saying, I'm worried about my student. Could you please send someone to check on them? Sometimes this will come through the desk. Sometimes this will come from the RA on-call phone. In all of those situations, you always want to call LOC or direct to your RC if it's during business hours. Again, we do not give the LOC number out, but we do want to make sure that we're taking down the student's name and the parent's contact info so the RC can call them back to get more information if needed. So that seems like a no-brainer, but it often happens that folks will be working the desk, a parent will call and say, hey, I'm worried about my student, and then you'll say your typical thing about we're not allowed to give you information, and then you'll hang up the phone, and then you'll realize that we have no number to call the parent back, and we don't know who their child is. So make sure that we're getting that information so we can follow up appropriately. It's important to know, and you can share this with parents, but also just important for you to know that we're happy to help track down students. In most cases for welfare checks, it's just because the student's phone died, or maybe they just don't want to talk to their parents, and we will find them and say, hey, you need to call your mom, or whatever the case might be. But at the University of Wyoming, the official way that we have welfare checks conducted is through UWPD. And so it is okay to tell parents that if they're really concerned about their student, their next step should probably be to call UWPD. And then along the lines of FERPA, and this is something that you might be explaining to parents over the phone, if not you, definitely the RC, is that we can take any information from the parent that they would like to share about what's going on, why they're concerned, their student's name, all that stuff, but we cannot share information back to them like the room numbers, when we saw them last, or once we eventually make contact. It's on the student to actually get in touch with their parents to make sure that the parents know that they're okay. In most cases, we're not able to call the parents and say, hey, we found your child, they're doing okay. So that's important to know. And then lastly, this is the final slide of this presentation. We want to draw your attention to, in your RA manual, there is a one-page document called the Incident Response Matrix. And this is a chart that has all the different types of incidents that might occur in the residence halls and apartments and who you need to call in each situation. This is probably the single most important document within the manual with regard to incident response that you should be familiar with. I would even suggest maybe taking a copy, laminating it, and putting it up somewhere in your room, maybe taking it with you when you're on rounds. It's really important as a cheat sheet to know what to do in different situations. And then similarly, beyond the incident response matrix, which is more of a summary, we have a very specific incident response protocol section that goes over each possible incident and step-by-step what you're supposed to do. And so I didn't go over that in this online training, but that's something you can go over on your own time to get more details about some of those situations that we talked about in this training. And then some final takeaways. In most cases, especially as you look at the incident response matrix, you'll notice that in most cases, you'll need to call your supervisor or LOC. And note that you can always call LOC with a question or if you need help. So even if it's a situation where you don't think that LOC needs to be called, you can still call if you're unsure or if you need help. We would much rather you call LOC when you don't need to than to not call LOC when you have to, because that can get us into some pretty serious situations if we're not appropriately reporting things when we need to. And then also, we always want you to keep your safety in mind, so we are never asking you as an RA to approach a situation if you feel unsafe. That's why we have LOC, and that's why we have UWPD. So if anything, if you're like, hey, I know that this needs to be addressed on campus, but I don't feel safe or comfortable doing that, call UWPD. They'd be happy to do that for you. Call LOC to make sure that they know what's going on. And then lastly, there is a post-training quiz. I know that this session has had a lot of information in it. You might want to refer back to sections of this video. So there is a quiz. Make sure that you do spend a lot of time on this content. It's very important. We will have opportunities during training to review some of these different nuances. You'll have opportunity to practice responding to some of these incidents, but this is one of the more important online trainings that we have. So take this quiz seriously. You can use your RA manual, you can use this video, but please do not use other RAs to complete this quiz. So thank you so much for your attention, and if you have any specific questions about any content that was in this training, please let your supervisor know, and we'd be glad to sit down with you and talk about what that might look like. So thanks again.